semuanya, apa kabar? Pastinya kabar baik, bukan? Bersama saya Romeo Dir Junior di channel yang spesial membahas tentang video-video apologet Kristen dan video-video kesaksian Kristen yang berasal dari sumber-sumber data yang terpercaya dan valid. Video ini bertujuan hanya ingin mengedukasi penonton tentang apa yang dibahas sesuai judul video.
In my country, abandoning one's faith is not something that translates into renouncing a religion as many imagine. It is something much more subtle, but also much more painful. It means that your own father can decide, quietly and without fanfare, to hand you over to the authorities, firmly believing that he is saving your soul, even if to do so he has to break the deepest bonds of love and trust.
Saudara-saudara sekalian, untuk lebih jelasnya silakan menonton video berikut ini sampai selesai, sehingga Anda bisa paham dan mengerti apa yang dibahas. Jangan lupa tinggalkan pendapat Anda di kolom komentar. Selamat menonton. Terima kasih. God bless you.
There were no shots fired, no fair trial, with the right to defense or appeal, just a silent and relentless sentence, a gesture that was enough to lock me in a cold and isolated cell. But all of this was already planned long before the moment they knocked on the door to take me away. It all started way back when I still believed that true honor was to blindly follow everything I was taught, without ever questioning, without ever doubting. My name is Reza Hosseini, and my story began in the holy city of Mashhad in northeastern Iran, a place where the marble walls of Imam Reza's shrine gleam in the sunlight, and the hushed halls of the seminary hum with the learning of future religious leaders. I was known simply as the son of the sheikh. My father, Mullah Josin Hosseini, was a respected imam, a master of the Quran, and a man whose stern gaze commanded respect, even in silence. He was my beacon, my example, and for many years, almost my God. For as long as I can remember, my life has been shaped by one purpose, to serve Islam as he did. I learned to recite Surah Al-Fatiha before I could even read Persian, while other children ran and played in the dusty streets of the Imamic neighborhood. I spent hours in a windowless room memorizing sacred verses under the supervision of a white-bearded old man who smelled of burning incense and ancient leather. By the time I was 10, I had memorized more than half of the Quran. My father, with pent-up pride, would place his hand on my head and say, "You will carry our name further than I ever could. You will be a light in the darkness." People in the neighborhood looked at me with reverence. Men bowed slightly, and women called me Little One. Although I was not a direct descendant of the Prophet, my father's reputation invested me with an almost inherited sanctity. But despite all this prestige and respect, something inside me didn't fit. It wasn't a loud rebellion, but a quiet restlessness, an emptiness that was hard to explain, a doubt that was beginning to form and that I couldn't yet put into words. I was missing a kind of love that wasn't in the repeated words of the Quran. My mother, on the other hand, was a quiet presence in our home, like so many women in our culture. She made tea with delicate hands, cooked saffron rice, and washed my father's white robes, all in silence. But one time, when I was 12, I found her crying in the kitchen. For a moment I thought something had broken or that my father had scolded her. She just looked at me, her eyes brimming with tears, and said softly, "Some hearts desire things no one can see." At the time, I didn't fully understand her words, but as the years passed, those words became the first echo of a world I had yet to discover. My days were filled with a nearly unchanging routine. Seminary, mosque, visits to my father's side to comfort grieving families, and meetings with other clergy. My father displayed me proudly, as if I were his greatest treasure, and in a way, I was. He dreamed of me as his successor, the one who would keep the flame of faith burning, protecting it from the threats posed by the modern world. But within me, restlessness grew. There was an invisible crack in the perfection of my life, and this crack, silent and imperceptible, would open into an abyss. I was 17 when I found the thing that would change everything. It was a hot, dusty afternoon in the center of Mashhad. A neighbor was cleaning out the storage room of his old bookstore, and among the piles of yellowed papers and forgotten encyclopedias, a small, thin, crumpled pamphlet fell to the floor, almost unnoticed. Curious, I bent down to pick it up and read the cover. Sayings of Isa al-Masih. It was not an Islamic book, nor was it political propaganda. It was something different, something forbidden. I looked around quickly. No one was watching me. I hid the pamphlet under my robe and took it with me. For days I kept that secret between the pages of my tafsir notebooks. Every night, after the house had fallen silent and slumbered, I would go into the bathroom, lock the door, and sit on the cold floor. There, in the darkness, I would quietly read those words that seemed to whisper straight to my soul. Love your enemies. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. I am the way, the truth, and the life. These words struck me with a force I had never felt before. They were not harsh commands or rigid rules, but gentle, compassionate promises from someone who knew human pain inside out. Isa, or Jesus, was not just a distant prophet. He seemed like someone who had experienced suffering, love, and hope in his own heart. And that's how, without realizing it, that simple sheet of paper began to crumble the foundations of the world I always believed in. And yet I knew all too well that what I was doing was a crime, an invisible crime, but one as real as any other in the eyes of my world. The son of an imam should never have allowed himself to read those words, much less think about them. Yet I could not stop. It was as if something inside me had awakened, crying out for answers that were not on the path laid out for me since birth. For weeks, I lived in a silent tension, a silent heaviness that accompanied me at every step. During the day, at the mosque, I continued to act as I always did. I recited with devotion, I greeted the faithful with the expected reverence, I attended seminary classes, immersed in the lessons that were shaping me. But it was at night, in that secret moment when everyone was asleep and the lights in the house were dimmed, that I could finally close the door to my room and hear another voice. A voice that did not come from the Quran, but from something new, strange, and deeply comforting. I remember one clear night, sitting on the cold bathroom floor, reading about the forgiveness offered even to those who persecute us. The words hit me in a way I couldn't explain, and unable to contain myself, I began to cry. Silent, unshed tears, as if something inside me had shattered into 1,000 pieces, but had also been freed. For the first time, I felt that it wasn't wrong to be broken, that it was okay to feel pain, to feel doubt, and still find hope. It was then and there that I made my first real act of faith, an act of courage and fear mixed together. One night, trembling after days of studying how to circumvent government protections, I downloaded a copy of the Gospel from the Forest Network at a hidden internet cafe in the city center. The file was a forbidden treasure, a small but potent flame. I carried it in a pen case as if I were carrying a bomb ready to explode. I began reading the Gospel of John at dawn, chapter by chapter, with tired eyes but a hungry heart. It wasn't rebellion, it was hunger, a silent hunger for something the world I lived in didn't offer. I prayed, even without knowing the right words, speaking in the dark, looking at the ceiling, sharing with Isa the secrets I couldn't reveal to anyone, the crushing loneliness, the feeling of imprisonment that religion imposed on me, the constant fear I no longer wanted to carry. The first time I said the name Isa under my breath, it felt like I had committed a betrayal. I whispered it fearfully as if the simple act might condemn me, but to my surprise, I felt no guilt. I felt a peace so profound that I had never experienced it, not even in the most solemn moments of the mosque. This peace, however, soon aroused suspicion. My behavior began to change, subtly, almost imperceptible to others, but blatant to those who knew me well. I stopped asking questions in class, my answers became short, and I began to avoid discussions that used to involve me. My father, always attentive, noticed, even though he never said a word. His penetrating gaze was enough, as if he wanted to read my soul. I tried to hide what was happening inside me, naively believing that I could still control this flame before it became a blaze. But I didn't understand that in a place like mine, true faith is not something that can be hidden for long. At home, the tension grew ever denser, an ember that no one dared to blow on, but that burned silently. My father's silences, once merely absent, now carried an almost physical weight. I tried hard to keep up appearances, obedient, present, disciplined with the Quran, but my heart no longer sang the same sacred words with the same fervor it once had. Isa's voice echoed within me, whispering through the halls of the seminary and in the shadows of the prayer halls. Group prayers, which had once filled me with respect and reverence, began to sound hollow, like soulless, repetitive choreography. Why so much rigidity? Why so much fear? Why did religion seem more like a control mechanism than an expression of love? I began to understand that the God I knew, the one my father and the seminary had introduced me to, was a God of blind obedience. But the God that Isa revealed in her secret whispers was different, a God who drew near to the wounded heart, who listened without shouting, who loved without imposing conditions. My bedroom became my secret sanctuary. There, I hid the flash drive with the gospel. Before going to sleep, I would put on my headphones and listen to the recordings of the chapters of John in Farsi. I would close my eyes and see Isa walking among the marginalized, touching the untouchables, forgiving the traitors. The image of a God made flesh, walking among us without temples, without turbans, tore me apart, and, at the same time, rebuilt me. I prayed in whispers, looking out the window at the starry sky, not knowing if my words would reach anywhere, but I couldn't stop. It was as if each prayer removed a stone from the fortress that had imprisoned me since childhood. I was alone, or so I thought. I didn't know anyone who shared this hunger, but I felt an invisible presence that filled my nights and sustained me. However, each step towards the truth pushed me deeper into the abyss. That's when my father started asking more direct questions. He watched me silently as I prayed, as if trying to unravel a secret hidden in my trembling hands or in my lost gaze. Sometimes he would question me directly about the books I was reading, in a calm voice that carried an invisible force. One night, during dinner, without even looking me in the eye, he uttered a sentence that froze me. When a son strays from the path, The Father is accountable before God. My entire body shivered. I lowered my head, feeling fear tighten around my throat like an invisible rope. I didn't know if it was a warning, a plea, or a sentence already written. On Fridays, during congregational prayer, the sermon seemed to echo directly within my chest. The preachers, with their firm voices and sharp words, spoke of internal enemies, of those who were lost through foreign doctrines and crooked paths. It was as if each word cut into the skin of my soul, because deep down, I knew those words were for me. Although no one knew the truth hidden within my heart, I had already crossed an invisible line, a boundary from which there was no return. One morning, unable to hide the fire that was burning silently in my chest any longer, I decided to write my own prayer. On a piece of paper torn from my school notebook with a trembling hand, I let out everything I could not say out loud. God, I don't know if you are listening to me, but if you are like Isa says, then save me. Not from my enemies, but from myself. From fear, from lies, from silence. That sheet of paper was my most sacred secret, the truest and most desperate offering I had ever made. Days later, my father found that prayer. He didn't say a word, he didn't make a gesture, he just left the paper resting on my pillow. He closed the door to my room slowly, silently, and left. At that moment, I understood that the time for hiding who I really was over. It was a mild spring evening in Mashhad. The smell of incense mingled with the aroma of roasting lamb wafting from the kitchen, and in the distance the call to prayer echoed, steady and distant. But inside me, chaos reigned. I sat in the living room, next to my father, my mother, and my younger brothers, all present, all together, but separated by a silence too heavy to break. I listened without hearing, ate without hunger, breathed without faith. I knew at that moment that something inside me had broken forever. My prayer paper, that simple sheet of paper, was more than just scribbled words. It was a sentence, a flame that had burned away what was left of my childhood. My father ate in silence, without looking at me, and when I finished, I got up and went to my room, where I lay down on the thin mattress, staring at the cracked ceiling. I tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. I could only silently repeat Isa's name, as if it were my anchor in the midst of an invisible storm that was dragging me down. It was almost midnight when I heard footsteps in the hallway. Not the usual footsteps of my mother or my brothers, but firm, determined steps with a rhythm that announced something inevitable. 3 sharp knocks on the door and my father came in. He was dressed in his traditional white clothes, his face serious and serene, almost solemn. "Get up, pray, get dressed." He spoke bluntly, as if it were the last command before an irrevocable sentence. I didn't ask why. Deep down, I already knew. My hands were shaking as I put on my clean pants and shirt. I picked up my sandals, hesitated for a moment over the flash drive with the gospel, and decided to leave it on the table. It seemed like there was no point in hiding that forbidden flame anymore. We left the house without saying a word. At the door, 2 men in black jackets were waiting. One of them had a tired, cruel look in his eyes. The other was holding a small notebook. They were not wearing official uniforms, but I recognized them immediately. Basig, the paramilitary militia that obeyed the regime's orders. They didn't need a warrant. My father just nodded. One of the men placed a heavy hand on my shoulder and whispered, "Don't resist." As they led me down the dark alley, I looked back one last time. My father was still standing in the doorway, motionless, not crying, not speaking, just watching me. And then, almost in a whisper that the wind carried away, he said, "I give you up to save your soul." I couldn't tell if those words were a gesture of faith or condemnation, but they stayed with me, sharp and painful, even after the van closed its doors and the engine roared to life. That night there were no screams, no resistance, just a thick silence. A silence that felt like a veil between everything I was and everything that was to come. And it was in this silence, in this terrifying and hopeful emptiness, that I began to understand. Following Isa was not just changing religion, it was dying to everything I had been, to be born finally into something completely different. The journey to Tehran was long, but in truth I could barely notice the hours that dragged by in those 4 cramped walls. I was handcuffed between 2 men, inside an unmarked windowless van, where the silence was as heavy as the fear that squeezed my chest. Every curve on that road seemed to turn my empty stomach, and my mind was lost trying to understand what was really happening. I knew I was trapped, but I could not understand exactly what crime I had committed. For my family, for my culture, for my country, reading the gospel in secret, praying to Isa, was the same as betrayal, an unforgivable heresy. But for me, it was simply a sincere search for something true, a light in the midst of darkness. When the van finally stopped, before the sun had even risen, they took me inside a dark, enclosed place surrounded by high walls and barbed wire fences. It was Evin Prison, a name that for many is synonymous with fear, disappearance, silent pain, and the echoes of screams that no one dares to hear. There, they stripped me of everything. My belt, my shoes, my watch. Even my name seemed to be ripped from my identity. I was thrown into a tiny cell, a cold cubicle less than 2 meters wide, lit by a dim bulb that never went out, and with no windows to show me that time continued to pass outside. The first few days were a huge void. With no human contact, a tray of cold rice and a bottle of water delivered once a day, I began to lose track of day and night. The silence was overwhelming, and to keep from going crazy, I began to talk to myself. I would repeat in a low voice the verses I could remember from the Gospel of John, trying to hold on to something, anything that would give me strength. In my head, Isa's words sounded like a promise. In the world you will have tribulation, but take courage. I have overcome the world. It was the only comfort in that pit of loneliness. On the 4th day came the first interrogation. They blindfolded me and led me down a damp hallway where the musty smell seemed to permeate my bones. I sat across from a man who refused to identify himself, his voice dry and cold, like the room I was in. He asked me questions that cut like razors. Do you have contact with foreign Christians? Do you know any enemies of Islam? Do you believe that Isa is superior to Muhammad? I said nothing, not out of bravery, but because any word could be used to hurt someone I loved. He sighed and murmured, "We have time." And the cruel game began. In the days that followed, the interrogations became routine, sometimes short and harsh, sometimes long and silent, almost as if fear were an invisible weapon within those walls. They offered small favors, a cigarette, a cup of tea, a softer rug to sleep on, all in exchange for cooperation that I could not give. I was not part of any network. I did not know any leaders. I just wanted to understand my faith, one step at a time. At night, the light that never went out tortured my tired eyes. My body ached from the cold floor and my mind whirled between memories and doubts. I closed my eyes and saw my father's face. Sometimes I felt angry at him. Other times, I tried to understand his silence and his heavy gaze. Maybe he still wanted to save me, I thought, but I knew deep down that I was already an embarrassment to him, a son who had died on the floor of his house. On the 7th day, the threats changed tone. We know that other young people have fallen into the same trap as you. We want names, locations. I had nothing to hand over, nothing to report. I had found the gospel alone. Isa had found me alone. And if this was a crime, I would pay for it alone without involving anyone. There was a night when anguish overcame me. I threw myself on the floor of my cell, wishing that this tiredness would last forever, that I would never wake up. But in that deep silence, I remembered a phrase I had read at home in a moment of hope. He came to his own, and his own did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, he gave the right to become children of God. At that moment, I understood something that no one could take away from me. I was not just a prisoner of Iran. I was the daughter of an invisible king, protected by a force that no cell could imprison. Evin Prison was not just a concrete place. It was an echoless pit, a place where time seemed to freeze and hope seemed to disappear. But even there, in that abyss, Isa's voice found me, like a beacon in the storm. The human body can adapt to almost anything, they say. But here, the limits of endurance were tested mercilessly. After the first 10 days of total isolation, the sessions they called intensive correction began, a cruel euphemism for what I soon learned was torture. They took me to a small, cold room lit by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, which cast unsettling shadows on the walls. In the center, an iron chair sat bolted to the floor, rigid and unforgiving. It was there that the interrogations began to turn into something more brutal, something I could not avoid. At first, the orders were simple and cruel, to stand still for hours on end without the right to rest or to speak. Silence was imposed so rigidly that each second seemed like an eternity. Then came the shoving, the shouting in my ear, the psychological games that drained my soul. They took away my right to sit, denied me access to the bathroom until I passed out from holding it in for so long. They forced me to drink liters of water, like a slow torture, so that I would beg for a simple relief, and each plea was more humiliating than the last. The silence, in turn, was a provocation, an invitation for them to lose their patience and increase the pressure. On a night that seemed to have no end, while my legs were tied to the legs of the chair and my arms were outstretched, they put headphones on me. The sound that reached me was unbearable. Distorted screams, metallic noises, disjointed words repeated over and over, an auditory torment that tore me apart from the inside. One of the officers whispered almost gently, "Give me just one name, just one. You don't have to carry this weight alone." But I had no names to give, no networks to betray. I carried with me only a story, a faith that I was still beginning to understand, and a God who seemed to be moving away with every second. It was just when my body felt like it was about to break, when every muscle and bone screamed in pain, that I began to pray. There were no beautiful words or eloquent phrases, just moans, disjointed thoughts, stifled murmurs. Lord, I am here. If you are, do not abandon me. If you see me, hold my mind, because my body can't take it anymore. Even though I didn't feel anything concrete, something was happening. The simple connection with this invisible being kept my soul alive, lit up in the darkness. One morning they woke me up with sharp blows and dragged me down the hallway without a word. They poured cold water on my head and forced me to carry bricks across the yard for hours. One of the jailers said with unsettling calm, "This Jesus of yours doesn't seem very useful." Without thinking, I replied, "He's not here to free me. He's here to never leave me alone." It was the first time I had spoken out loud about my faith in front of them. From that moment on, it was clear that they wouldn't break me so easily, and the pressure only increased. They began to play with my emotions. They showed me photos of my family, my mother in the kitchen, my brothers on school trips, and then they said that my father had already given his testimony, collaborating with them. I don't know if it was true, but this doubt was the cruelest torture of all, not knowing if my family had abandoned me, if they hated me, or if they still prayed for me, or if I was just a dead man to them. And then they started torturing me with smells. It may sound strange, but it was real. Locked in a cell where chemicals were poured on the floor, the air was filled with an irritating fumes that burned my eyes and throat. For hours, I gasped, gasping for air, my mind screaming for some relief. When they finally let me rest in a clean cell, they made it seem like a concession. See what happens when you don't cooperate? I was shaking uncontrollably. At times, I couldn't control my body to the point of urinating on myself. It wasn't fear, it was exhaustion. By the 20th day, the weight of prison was already showing. My body had become so thin that my ribs protruded like sharp blades. I could barely walk, dragging myself to the bathroom, where the walls seemed to whisper secrets that only I could hear. The bright lights in the cell made me see shadows, shapes that disappeared when I blinked. Isa appeared in my dreams, sometimes speaking firmly, sometimes silently, but always present. One night, I saw him sitting in a corner of the cell, looking at me. He said nothing, did not move. But when I woke up, I felt like I had been crying in my sleep. The nights there were longer and harder than the days. Once, they made me stand in front of a mirror and forced me to repeat the words they wanted to hear. I betrayed my faith. I betrayed my father. I betrayed my country. Each refusal was met with a punch in the stomach. But what really hurt me was not the violence. It was when they left me alone, staring at my own eyes reflected in the cold glass. I didn't recognize myself. That image hurt more than any blow, but something inside me resisted. Every morning I clung to one verse, just one, like a lucky charm. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. I repeated it silently like a sacred chant, my lifeline, my anchor. Even when my flesh ached and my bones creaked, my spirit continued to pray. And it was this faith, in the midst of that hell called Evan, that kept my resistance alive. Without warning, I was transferred to another location. One gray morning, after a night when my back pain had almost prevented me from standing, the cell door creaked open. They shouted at me to gather my things, but I had nothing. All I could do was stagger to my feet and follow the guard down a narrow hallway that seemed to sink deeper and deeper beneath my feet. The air was heavy, humid, almost suffocating, as if the space itself had lost its breath. I was led to a cell even smaller than the previous one. There were no windows, no trace of natural light, only a dim light bulb hung from the ceiling, flickering as if it were about to go out. The floor was rough, cold, raw concrete with no covering. The walls, stained with vague marks, seemed to bear stories of suffering that I did not want to imagine. In a corner, a rusty bucket served as a toilet. There was no bed, no mattress, just a thin, moldy blanket thrown on the floor. When the door closed behind me, I felt time freeze. Inside, there were no days or nights, minutes or hours, only slow breaths and a whirlwind of thoughts that multiplied in the darkness around me. For the first 2 days, there was absolute silence. No one asked me anything, no one spoke to me. The food arrived once a day, always cold, always the same, tasteless, inconsolable. I began to talk to myself, not out of madness, but so as not to forget the sound of my own voice. I whispered softly, almost breathlessly, "Pray, Joseni Mashat, son of Josein, you are not dead. You are still here." It was a reminder, an anchor to my identity, a way to hold on to my humanity in that void. But the unstimulated confinement began to take its toll. My mind began to play tricks on me. Flashes, faces, and voices appeared and disappeared, as if from another dimension, a silent, shared suffering. On one of those endless nights, I saw my mother sitting at the foot of the cell, holding a steaming bowl of rice. I bent down to pick up the bowl, but when I touched it, it evaporated into thin air. I fell to the floor, my face smashed against the concrete. I had passed out standing up. In the midst of that darkness, a memory came to me like a flash of lightning, the story of Peter in prison. I saw myself as he did, chained, weak, waiting for a deliverance that never came. But I didn't expect miracles or angels. I just asked not to lose faith before madness consumed me. I prayed, not knowing whether to speak out loud or just in the silence of my heart. I clung to a simple phrase, "You are with me." I wasn't begging to leave, but for him to dwell within me, to fill that void when all around was darkness. I told myself, if this is my tomb, let it also be my altar. The days passed, endlessly without seeing a single human being. I became silence and waiting, an invisible resistance in that cubicle. It was in that windowless space with no apparent hope that something inside me grew stronger. I no longer wanted to run away, I wanted to obey. If Isa brought me there, I was not alone, even when all I could see were those 4 cold walls. It was Thursday, or at least that's what I concluded, counting the meals on my fingers. It had been more than a week in that silent confinement. I didn't speak, I didn't ask questions. I breathed, I slept restlessly. I woke up without reason, I prayed without a single word. The world outside seemed to have ceased to exist. And then, the impossible happened. Different footsteps echoed down the corridor. Quick, firm, resolute. The iron door swung open abruptly, and the pale light of the corridor blinded me for a moment. 2 men entered, without saying a word, just ordered me to stand up. My legs barely responded. I had to hold onto the wall to keep from falling. One of them thrust into my hands a change of clothes. Trousers, a white shirt, simple sandals. Ordinary clothes, not a prisoner's uniform. They escorted me through hallways I no longer recognized. We climbed stairs, passed through a set of double doors, and the air changed. I smelled the sun, the freshness of freedom, even if it was distant. My lungs opened as if I had forgotten how to breathe properly. I was taken to a small room, where an officer, in an impeccable uniform and with an impassive face, looked at me briefly. Without looking up, he signed some papers, stamped them, and said in a dry voice, "Parole." There was no judgment, no explanation, not even a question. They returned a bag with my few belongings, an empty wallet, a crumpled document, and my mother's ring. I put the ring on my middle finger, as if it were a silent pact, a promise of reunion. Outside, a taxi was already waiting for me. Someone, I don't know who, had already paid the fare back to Mass. During the entire journey, silence dominated the space between me and the driver. Not a word, not a gesture. I looked out the window, but the world outside seemed like a distant, almost unreal scene. The city went on as usual. Mosques raised their minarets on the horizon. The market was bustling with voices and aromas. Men dressed in white turbans and gray robes crossed the streets like familiar shadows. Everything remained the same, except me. When I got home, it was already night. The street was strangely silent, as if time had slowed down to wait for my return. I knocked on the door and my mother opened it. Her gaze, at first confused, then fixed, met mine as if I were a ghost come back to life. There were no tears, no words, just a firm embrace filled with silent understanding. As if, at that moment, she knew that words would be incapable of carrying the weight of what I had experienced. I spent the night on the cold floor of my old room, unable to close my eyes. My father did not appear. His absence screamed louder than any words. In their world, I had simply ceased to exist. And yet, that night, I felt a strange peace. A serenity unlike anything I had known since Isa found me. It was not the peace of freedom from the body, but the peace that comes from understanding that true faith is not measured by what we achieve, but by what we are willing to sacrifice. Mashhad had not changed. The streets were still decorated with the green and black flags that accompanied seminary ceremonies. The walls of the place echoed with verses from the Quran, while the voices of the imams still filled the air through the mosque's loudspeakers. Everything looked the same. And yet each step I took through the streets of my childhood felt like crossing a stage where the play was still going on. But I was no longer part of the cast. My mother tried to act like she used to. She cooked me hot meals, spoke to me tenderly, made me tea in the late afternoon. But there was something different in her eyes. A quiet sadness, a painful knowledge that I couldn't stay there anymore. My brothers barely spoke to me, looking away when they passed me in the hallway. Not out of anger, but out of fear. Fear of what my presence represented. One afternoon, I found my younger brother in the backyard. He stared at me for a long moment, as if he were about to ask me something, but the words never came. He simply turned and ran, leaving a void that seemed to fill the entire space between us. The next day, I found a child's drawing on my bed, a white dove with a twig in its beak. No words accompanied the image, but I clutched the paper like a whisper of hope, a silent prayer. I don't know if he left it there, but it was a gesture that warmed me. My father, on the other hand, never looked at me again. For the first few days after my return, he came and went like a stranger, avoiding all contact. One silent morning, as we drank coffee without exchanging a word, he said, "You can't stay here anymore." There was no shouting, no explanation, just the firmness of someone who has pronounced a final sentence with no room for dispute. I tried to talk to him only once. I approached him while he was arranging the books on the shelf, telling him that I didn't hate him, that I still loved him, that I only wanted to seek the truth. He didn't answer. He continued to arrange the books with trembling hands. Before he left, he murmured, "The truth doesn't destroy families." That sentence pierced me like a knife, a pain that wouldn't heal. I tried to go back to college, but they found out my bachelor's degree had been revoked. For security reasons, they said. No school would accept me. I was branded, an apostate, a traitor. The doors closed one by one, but life, even in the darkness, found a way. I began to secretly attend a small group of believers, hidden on the outskirts of the city. There, amidst whispers and wary glances, I met others like me, those cast out from their families, their jobs, their worlds. We shared our stories with tears and suppressed smiles. I met an older man who had spent years in prison for distributing handwritten copies of the gospel. He told me something that stuck with me. Faith is not an idea. It is a wound that never stops bleeding, but also never heals. Our meetings were quiet, sometimes in the darkness of an abandoned garage. There were no crosses, no pulpits, no recorded hymns, just worn wooden chairs, a lantern in the center, and torn Bibles. Each person recited a verse they knew by heart, seeking answers, seeking peace, but most of all, seeking direction. I knew I couldn't go on living as a ghost in that city. One night, as I walked alone down the street where I was born, I realized I had to leave. It wasn't cowardice. It was an act of love, to protect my family, to preserve what little was left of what we called home. Following Isa meant giving up everything, even the illusion of belonging. That night, with trembling hands and a heavy heart, I wrote a letter to my mother. It wasn't a full-on goodbye, nor a dramatic outburst, just simple, sincere words, a shy thank you. Thank you for giving me life and letting me seek my truth. I carefully left the letter hidden under my pillow, like someone leaving a secret message for a distant soul. Then, silently, I packed the few things I had and left the house without looking back, feeling that each step was a cut to my past. Leaving Iran is not like deciding to travel to another city or move to another country on your own. It is like crossing an invisible border that exacts a toll far greater than the physical distance. It is losing the identity you have built, leaving behind your family, your stories, your friends, everything you once called home. For weeks, I walked the dusty streets of Mashhad, often at night, carrying a crumpled map of the Turkish border in my pocket. I wondered silently if Isa really wanted me to leave everything behind. In the silence of the alleys, I begged her, if I have to go, show me the way. But if I have to stay, give me the strength to endure. The answer came one quiet night, without words, just a look. My mother appeared at that moment, standing in the doorway of my room, looking at the map in my tired eyes. She didn't say anything. She just went in, came back with a small bag in her hands and placed it next to me. Inside were real tickets and a handkerchief that I had worn as a child, with the smell of home still lingering. She said, her voice choked, "You're going, and maybe I'll never see you again. But I prefer to know that you're alive, even if you're far away." It was the first time I saw how much fear and love can live in the same gesture. The network that helped me get out was small, almost invisible. A Christian woman who worked undercover selling spices in the imam's market was the one who connected me to this chain of courage and faith. Within a few days, everything fell into place. I had no time for real goodbyes, not to see my brothers, not to face my father. When we met for the last time, it was only to pretend not to know each other, two strangers separated by 5 meters in a world of pain. But he left something in my pocket, a napkin with a handwritten verse. "Even if father and mother forsake you, I will never leave you." The journey to Urmia was full of tension and fear. Every military checkpoint seemed like a sentence. Every look from a young soldier carried an uncertain fate. At one of the checkpoints, I was forced to open my backpack. Inside, nothing but clothes, a Bible hidden in math paper, and a notebook full of verses. The guard looked at me with a look that seemed to recognize the struggle I was carrying and simply returned the things in silence. When I arrived in Urmia, I was met by Farhad, a man with a hard face but gentle hands. He led me to a motorbike that took us to an isolated house on the outskirts. There I met 3 other men, all Christians, all carrying similar wounds. We slept on the ground, in silence, sharing a silent solidarity. That night I dreamed of fire, houses burning, faces screaming my name, a portent of what the future might hold. I woke up sweating, my heart racing. Farhad gave me water and said softly, "Tomorrow you will cross the border. If you have something to settle with God, do it tonight." The crossing began at dusk. We walked in a single file without exchanging words, following a path between the hills. The guide gave us clear instructions. If someone falls, keep walking. If you hear gunshots, don't scream. If you get lost, follow the riverbed. The air was cold, dry, with the ancient smell of forgotten earth. Each step was a struggle. My legs trembled, my chest ached, my heart pounded like a drum. As dawn approached, we stopped in a small cave to rest. Farhad whispered, "Almost there. From here you'll see the lights." I approached the entrance and looked out over the horizon. It wasn't a city, but 2 lights hanging from a farmhouse, illuminating the darkness of the hill. It was Turkey. I knelt there on the frozen ground without praying. I just cried. Tears of relief, of fear, of all that I had already lost. I walked the last few feet alone, my body aching, my lips cracked, and my hands bleeding. But inside me at that moment, there was peace. Peace for the first time. I spent the night in an abandoned barn, clutching my Bible to my chest and covered with a wet, smelly blanket. It was the first time in my life that I slept without fear. Not of the past, not of the present, not of the future. Arriving in Turkey did not mean arriving home. I had no documents, no address, nothing but my name, a few wet clothes, and the faith that had cost me everything. The first few days in that new country were a mixture of fear and amazement. No one chased me, no one interrogated me, no one forced me to kneel before an image. For the first time, I was just myself, a stranger trying to start over. It was like waking up from a long coma when your mind is still a bit confused and every sound that comes to you seems like an unexpected gift. I arrived in Kayseri, in the heart of Turkey, where a small community of Iranian Christians welcomed me. They were like me, refugees, exiles, people who had lost everything, their homes, their families, even their names, but who carried with them a flame of hope that would not go out. I shared a cramped room with 3 older men, their stories etched in the wrinkles on their faces and calloused hands. Together we shared dry bread and cheese and cheap tea that tasted like comfort. Our moments were filled with sacred verses, recited in low voices, almost like a salve for invisible wounds. The first time I attended a sung-aloud service, I couldn't hold back the tears. There were no grand cathedrals, no microphones, no talented musicians, just a simple room with weathered walls, plastic chairs, and a dozen worshippers. We sang in Farsi, our hands raised, crying and smiling at the same time, a mixture of pain and joy that could not be expressed in words. There, in that humble space, I realized something new. It wasn't just faith, it was certainty. I didn't just believe in Isa, I knew he was there with me. During the day, I worked in a bakery that employed undocumented refugees. It was hard work, kneading dough, carrying firewood, cleaning the ovens, but each effort was a silent offering, a sacrifice that gave me the strength to carry on. The pay was modest, barely enough to eat, but I was able to send some money to my mother in Mashhad. She wrote to me once from a borrowed phone without identifying herself. She didn't ask questions, didn't dig for details. She just wrote, "I love you. I know you're strong. Don't let them erase who you are." That message was my lifeline for weeks. Simple words that held me up when I was about to fall. I began to learn the gospel in Turkish, then in English. I discovered that Isa's word is not confined to just one language. It travels through all languages, speaking directly to people's hearts. I memorized verses, not just to remember, but to feel, to find myself in the words. I looked at the wooden cross hanging at the head of my bed and took a deep breath, finding in it an invisible home, a fortress in the midst of exile. I no longer needed gilded temples, elaborate liturgies, or rehearsed chants. What was enough for me was the silent voice of Isa, whispering within me, "I am your peace." Almost 3 years have passed since I crossed the border. I live in Turkey as a refugee, with a temporary permit, and an uncertain future looms over me like a constant shadow. Not every day is easy. The trauma doesn't just disappear with a simple hymn. There are times when the fear returns without warning. Sometimes, walking down the street, I feel like one of the Evin prison officers is in the crowd, staring at me. Other times, during the service, my father's harsh voice echoes in my mind, like a whisper that hurts and yet strengthens me. Even these tears, which I have shed so many times, have become part of my testimony, my faith, which is not based on titles, doctrines, or fear of hell. We follow Isa because he is the truth that loves, that embraces even those who have failed, that welcomes us in the midst of our imperfections. Sometimes, I dream of returning to Iran. I imagine walking down the streets of my childhood, hugging my mother without fear, looking into my father's eyes and telling him, "You gave me this to save my soul. And despite everything, you did it." He may never truly understand. He may never fully accept me. But even though I no longer have a place in what I once called home, I know that Isa is with me, a silent, constant, loving presence who fills all the voids left behind.